Okay, so I'm presenting, I graduated quite recently, just in January, so this is all quite fresh to me, so I thought I'd mix it up. This is a bit different from what my actual thesis presentation is. So the title is Collective Form, Infill Housing and New Domestic Spaces in Toronto's Residential Neighborhoods, and it kind of does what it says in the title. It's a thesis that, as Megan said, is really engaged with affordability and access to housing, as well as the quality of domestic space. And it positions itself within the residential neighborhoods, which, as Rolf suggested, are part of the official plan. So that's kind of the general situation. And it really, the work kind of arose out of being in practice in Toronto. I took a couple years out between undergrad and masters and worked in housing, doing mainly mid-rise condos. And there's a lot of kind of the larger parameters around that I was really dissatisfied with. It's very easy to see in Toronto now increasing unaffordability, people being kind of through gentrification and a lack of affordability forced to the periphery. And the city is really changing very quickly. And this is due to a lot of the forces that were alluded to, property values, increasingly global capital. But in the end, it's really a crisis of housing in the city. With that being said, there's not a lot of alternatives currently, but there's, within the city of Toronto, a rich history of, let's say, counter movements to the dominant production of housing, from the kind of early cooperative movements at Bain Avenue and Spruce Court, which I'll go into in further detail, and the kind of 1970s infill housing movement, led by Diamond and Myers, among others. And so, building from that framework, I've kind of proposed some prototypical strategies for low-rise, high-density housing. Within that context of Toronto's neighborhoods. So, what we often think of as the Toronto neighborhood is really a very particular downtown fabric predicated on a structure of street, front yard, home, and laneway, and a relatively dense urban fabric of single-family homes. But it's also, increasingly since amalgamation, a huge part of the city is the inner suburbs, Scarborough, North York, Etobicoke, and actually a geographically much larger area of the city. And often ignored in these conversations. And so within that geographic context, there's both kind of a shortage of affordable ownership housing, but also a shortage of rental housing. Currently, the vacancy rate in rental housing is at and around 1% in Toronto, which is hugely problematic. And that's kind of this demand, this kind of constant growth of the city alongside very mobile capital, low interest rates, has really been driving so much of this condo construction, building downtown, high-rise construction. And so you see kind of this new fabric emerging alongside the traditional neighborhoods of the downtown core and the inner suburbs. And of course, this kind of urban structure has a logic to it. There's a kind of a reason why we have so many areas of single-family homes in Toronto. The original subdivision of property was very much predicated on Toronto being a city of homes, of single-family homes. Lot sizes are very much determined by what could be economically developed by either an individual or a small-scale developer. And this is kind of illustrating that progressive subdivision of land And with each successive subdivision of land, there's kind of more profit to be had. And so within that kind of evolution of the city, part of the work in my thesis was kind of getting a typological understanding of essentially kind of the basic fabrics of the city, but also of exceptional conditions within that, insertions into those fabrics that present a different density and a different built form. And they're kind of cataloged here alongside the evolution of the city, chronologically as well as in terms of density. So, you know, the earliest kind of housing movements in the city were the cooperative movements of Spruce Court, which presented a significantly denser program within kind of a built form that was very similar to the residential neighborhoods. Dormer and gable roofs, 3-story homes. And today they're maintained as cooperatives, collective ownership of the property, and remain affordable housing within, you know, the very downtown core. Kind of as the city began to grow, particularly in the post-war period, those inner suburbs that I was alluding to were part of the metropolitan Toronto rather than a single city. The old city of Toronto, as shown here, is actually a very specific region, and up until 1996 was independent. However, at this time, we start to see a lot of the development of both the kind of single-family suburban neighborhoods as well as suburban towers in the park. We commonly associate that typology with the downtown, but it's actually quite pervasive within the inner suburbs. And while that peripheral expansion is going on, there's also kind of a very intensive program of urban renewal, the kind of large-scale replacement of existing residential neighborhoods with towers, whether kind of private developments like St. Jamestown, or public developments like Regent Park that is currently being renewed. And these urban renewal programs were certainly not embraced wholesale. There was resistance by local residents, and that kind of culminated with resistance to a particular project and the election in the 1970s of David Crombie as mayor and the Reform Council. So that kind of paved the way for activists like Jane Jacobs, who'd recently relocated to Toronto, to oppose a particular development on Sherbourne Street, just north of Dundas, that was slated for one of these tower renewal programs. And so in its place, Diamond and Myers proposed and built Sherbourne Lanes, which was quite a groundbreaking housing type. It essentially proposed something completely different to what it was being done in the city, and was done under the auspices of a public housing program. It's certainly not without problems, and they themselves kind of recognize that it goes against some of the established, the academic principles that they established for this density, but it's still a very interesting project, kind of predicated around a courtyard between existing Victorian homes and this new kind of 6-story infill. In a similar vein, Hydro Block was another proposal for urban renewal that met with resistance from local residents, and ultimately this was proposed in its place, and is again kind of a 4 to 5 story infill block. So Diamond and Myers were working with this kind of in its implementation. Barton Myers and George Baird also published Vacant Lottery, which is kind of the seminal text on this, proposing some of these principles for infill. Some of these principles were then later applied to the St. Lawrence Neighborhood Plan, which today is a neighborhood with a very high proportion of cooperatives, so resident-owned collective housing, and remains one of the kind of few affordable spaces within the downtown core today. So in 1996, the former city of Toronto was amalgamated with its inner suburbs to give us kind of the outline of Toronto that we recognize today. And alongside that, there was an official plan introduced. Rolf alluded to and went into some detail about. So if I say in this map, the red areas are the centers. So those are areas targeted for intensification. Blue areas are the employment lands that you guys are dealing with, it seems. And the kind of large beige expanse is really the neighborhoods. It's a very extensive fabric. Obviously, it covers a large portion of the city. And under the official plan, it's really designated as a static zone. No intensification and really no change. It's very hard to get anything other than a single-family home built there, which really precludes any densification in those zones. Also noted here and in the kind of secondary avenues plan are those areas designated for mid-rise development. So again, a more extensive area of the city, but really a huge portion of it that's still kind of protected from any development. And really that comes back to the kind of primacy of the single-family home in Toronto, both as a built form, but also as kind of a social and issue of image of the city, right? And so within that framework, the kind of a basic outline of the types of intensification that are going on, at least in the downtown core, the kind of stacked townhouse typology, mid-rise typologies along the avenues, and the kind of tower podium that's become so pervasive in the downtown core. These are all, generally speaking, developed as condos, which is, in fact, separate from the architectural typology. It's a legal framework for development and ownership that kind of preserves the essence of private ownership of property within a high-rise tower or other forms. And all of this development is again, Rolf alluded to this. This is Polchansky's 3 Cities in Toronto study showing increasing income polarization through time. So the red areas are areas that are below median income. The blue areas are areas that are above median income. And the kind of white zones are at or around median income. And you can really see the kind of disappearance of the middle here and the increasing polarization, largely due to the cost of property and the lack of availability of housing. And so this kind of crisis creates an inflection point, a point where we can propose to do things differently, where there's maybe sufficient interest within the city to kind of look at new ways of building, new ways of sharing space, new ways of living together. So this is kind of also, it's really a critique of the contemporary production of domestic space within those architectural and legal frameworks. The kind of primacy of private property and private space is really problematic as we start to look at ever-increasing densities and trying to accommodate that many more people in an urbane way. And again, like the similarities between the kind of construction of the single-family home in the 18th century and the kind of specificity of spaces within that home are really, they're taken as a factual or natural way of doing things today, but this is not, we should be clear, a construction emerging largely alongside the Industrial Revolution and really the emergence of the nuclear family as the predominant social structure, replacing extended families, neighborhood support networks that existed previously. And yeah, the kind of emergence of the nuclear family within that framework, and the single-family home's importance in its reproduction. From there, we can kind of begin to look for alternatives. One very interesting possibility is looking at contemporary developments in Europe, specifically in Germanic countries. Baugruppe are a form of cooperative, really. They incorporate elements from many typologies, including co-housing, but essentially they form a legal and organizational framework for individuals to collectively pool financial resources, pool individual expertise, and initiate resident-led development. So this is an example from Berlin, Ritterstrasse 50, and it's a recognizable mid-rise typology architecturally, but the spaces that it creates allow for a much greater reflection of the needs of residents, both in the collective spaces and in the private spaces. And another one on the River Spree in Berlin. And again, the architectural typology doesn't appear that different, but the spaces it creates are quite interesting. So kind of trying to apply this to Toronto, I chose two prototypical sites, one in the kind of downtown type fabric in the West End, and one in a kind of inner suburban fabric in the West End. So just for reference, that's downtown in the bottom right corner of the image from you, and kind of centered westward on Kiel. So the project went through a series of iterations within those fabrics, trying to both manipulate quantitative elements, density in its various measurements, persons per hectare, floor area, as well as the kind of more qualitative issues of access to light, privacy for neighbors, and ultimately kind of arrived at these two proposals, each one of which addresses two single-family lots, and tries to manipulate the built form in such a way that it has certainly a relationship to the existing, but exists at a much higher density. Each one of them proposes an increase in floor area of 2 times density, and an increase in persons per hectare of up to 6 times, depending on the configuration. And these are intended as potential projects, right? I'm not saying that these are certainly what should be built, but they're iterations of what could happen within these social and organizational frameworks if the potential for additional density in residential neighborhoods were to become practicable. And so there's kind of an idea about the larger replicability of these and the relationship to the context within that framework, as well as a reconfiguration of the domestic space of the unit from, in the case of the single-family home, the front yard, the foyer, kitchen, dining room, bedrooms, reconfiguring those elements with a much greater proportion of shared space, as well as the kind of traditional corridor and unit typology, reconfiguring that where the corridor really acts as a shared space with a degree of permeability into the units, and incorporating shared outdoor spaces, shared programs, the kind of traditional domestic spaces and domestic labor, the possibility for those to be collectivized, and kind of just, so this is the kind of downtown neighborhoods proposal predicated on a long narrow site with a long corridor relating to units off of that. And this is kind of, the space could be used within those corridors to spill out from the units for socializing, for children's play, for daycare. Again, just really trying to facilitate relationships between residents that are generally precluded by current architectural typologies. And in the case of the suburban context, kind of recognizing that rather than a consistent reading of street frontage in the downtown neighborhoods. Really, the fabric in the suburban neighborhoods is one of object and field. So actually recognizing the rhythm and scale of those single-family homes, it proposes kind of separate buildings centered around collective space. And again, a reconfiguration of the space within the unit, within the home. And that's it. Thank you very much.